Hello, everyone. Dave Klimaszewski here. I hope you're doing well. So, the topic of this module is money matters, nursing and personal finance. And before I dive into the content, I'd like to give you a little bit of my background. It'll give you a sense of my perspective and why I'm coming at this topic the way I am. So, I was raised in a fairly stable household, and my father was essentially raised in poverty, and he did well for himself and learned a lot throughout the course of his life as far as how to manage money. And I can remember as a younger person, as a teen, and even into my 20s, he did his best to pass on everything he had learned, his wisdom. But at that point in my life, I really didn't care a great deal about money or managing it. It felt something like a necessary evil. But I didn't walk the same path that my father did. And it really wasn't until my early 30s when I had my first child with my wife, and I realized that it was important to pay attention to this topic. If not for myself, for the people that depended upon me. And so the content that I'm going to send your way is stuff that I've learned over the last 10 years or so of my life. Not only in my personal life, but also for approximately the last decade or so that I've worked for UHS. I hope it helps. I'd like to get us going by asking a couple questions of you. Number one, was salary a component of your decision to become a nurse? I typically ask my nursing students what's motivated them to come to nursing school, and it's been fascinating over the last few years to see the increase in the number of people who are very open about the fact that salary was a primary motivating factor to become a nurse. How many of you have seen a jump in your income since becoming a nurse? When I run this class in person, it's fascinating to me. Easily over half, the majority of the class, responds affirmatively here that yes, I have indeed seen a jump. Some of you may be rolling into your nursing career having been a student your whole life, and so you've seen a massive jump in your income. We frequently see a lot of people transition from being nursing assistants to nurses, and so typically there too you're seeing an increase on the order of tens of thousands of dollars. So generally speaking, when I teach this course, I expect that the majority of the learners here have seen a substantial jump in income in the last year. So in light of that, how many of you are finally able to purchase some items you've always wanted or perhaps couldn't have before? For those of you who've seen a dramatic increase in your income, I would expect that some of those luxury items are now within reach. Maybe you're thinking about buying some things that you never could have bought before. So I'm often asked this question, why are we talking about this in the nurse residency program? The nurse residency generally focuses on the application of knowledge gained in nursing school and hopefully acquiring some hard skills, some soft skills that help you in the clinical environment. This is clearly a different conversation. Why money matters? Well, first and foremost, this was requested by a number of residents and actually more than one cohort. They essentially said to me, we know that the conversation about money, in particular, tuition reimbursement or the 403B retirement option or, benefits in general, they're covered in the orientation. But there's a degree of information overload. And I found that, by month 6 or by month 9 of working here at UHS, a lot of that has been forgotten. Some of it's been forgotten. And this is the point where the dust is sort of settling, where people start to think about it again. What should I be doing with my money at UHS? What benefits can I take advantage of? And third, and maybe most importantly, debt can negatively impact patient care. There are a number of studies out there that show that the stress of debt can negatively impact job performance. Let me give you one example how I see this play out in our environment. I've worked with a number of nurses who have a large amount of personal debt. And in an effort to get rid of that debt, those individuals work a large amount of overtime. I'm not talking 4 hours a week or 8 hours a week, picking up an extra shift. I'm talking about multiple shifts. People talking about 16 or 20 hours of overtime a week. And while I think we can handle that from time to time, doing that for a sustained period of time generally takes a toll. And there are also all sorts of studies, I'm sure you know of this, that suggest that if we work long shifts and substantial amounts of overtime, that ultimately the risk of error goes through the roof. It becomes very high. So why money matters? Ultimately, substantial amounts of personal debt and the stress associated with it, and perhaps the behaviors associated with it, can negatively impact patient care. And I think the other reason out there, when I've taught this class in the past, I've learned a couple things. Number one, some of you feel as though your parents have been rather poor examples of how to manage money. So you've come from a home environment where you've gotten little input as far as how to manage money as an adult. And I think the other thing in play here is, money is one of those things that we might not talk about. It's an awkward conversation. So I figure we might as well do it here in the residency program for these reasons. Hopefully by now you've seen the Money Personality Survey and have taken it, but I'm going to put a pause here. If you've not yet done this, please pause this video, go out to the module, take the Money Personality Survey, and then return. So at this point, hopefully all of you have taken the survey. I'm just going to run really quickly through the 6 types of people that this non-scientific survey sorts people into. Tends to be very fun. Number 1, the saver. I think this is pretty obvious what this type of person likes to do and what drives them. And the thing I appreciate about this survey is that not only does it give you something of a description, but it offers some advice to maybe balance out your quote-unquote money personality tendencies. The spender, I think this is obvious. The security seeker. For full disclosure, I tend to express my money personality strongest here. I sort into this category. And I got to tell you, for me, man, these bullet points are so true for me. The risk taker, kind of the opposite of my personality. Most people in life are more fearful of risks than the possible reward of a particular activity. But for the risk taker, it's kind of the opposite. The risk is not as concerning to you as the possible reward when it comes to money. The giver, let me just tell you a little bit about this. When I have run this course in person, I was absolutely shocked, and maybe I shouldn't have been, and thinking about it, maybe I shouldn't have been, but the vast majority of learners in the residency context, people who are nurses, sort into this category. And it was amazing to me. Probably 70% of hands in a room go up when it comes to sorting into this category. And it makes sense. When you look at the characteristics, they kind of describe the stereotypical nurse. Focus on and enjoy helping others, generous with time and money, feel responsible for others' well-being, put yourself first is hard to do. I should probably say at this point that a lot of this conversation is about managing money and saving money. But my objective here is not really to cram everybody into one particular mold, making you, a saver or a security seeker, but really to equip you with some options to save money so that you can do what you want with it. You may not be the type of person that wants to save up a massive nest egg for retirement. Maybe you want to save up money so that you can give it away. That's perfectly fine, but without a strategy to save that money, it makes it more difficult. You have less freedom, less choice to be able to express your personality. Finally, the flyer. My guess is that if you're a flyer, some of the flyers may have self-selected out and are not taking this module. But the flyer, if you're a flyer, this conversation may be uncomfortable. You may not want to do it. I think people that sort into this personality type don't enjoy money. This may have been me when I was younger. And so conversations about money are not terribly interesting. So we all relate to money differently, but I want to focus on what most of us can agree on, and that will be the foundation from which we move forward in this module. Number one, we all like freedom. I spent a few years living up in Canada. Canada has a slightly more collectivist bent than America, socialized medicine, and just a different culture. And my 4 years up there gave me the opportunity to reflect on just how much we Americans love our freedom. It's wired into our DNA. We love choice, freedom to hit the open road. The exploration of the Wild West is baked into our culture. So generally speaking, I think most of us would agree we like freedom. And I think it's pretty obvious that money provides freedom. Freedom to express our money personality in whatever way we choose, whether we're seeking security, or we're savers, or we want to pull down the arm on that slot machine and gamble and take a risk, or give gifts, or buy extravagant items. Money provides us the freedom to make those choices. On the flip side of that, I think most of us can agree that consumer debt can limit freedom. Wisdom literature uses very strong language about debt. So when you read some ancient texts and the wisdom they provide, they often speak of debt as a form of slavery or a form of bondage. And even though we might not use those words today, I think all of us can agree that consumer debt limits freedom. It limits our choices, that if you have a large amount of debt, there are things in life you simply cannot do. So, if we like freedom, then we may not want to pursue large amounts of consumer debt because that will limit our freedom. And then finally, I can honestly say I don't think I've met anyone who's told me that they don't want to retire someday. So I think most of us can agree we would like to retire someday, and ultimately to retire, we need to manage our money. So the objectives of this module. Number one, I'd like to give you something of a short-term plan. And I'll be honest, number one and number two, these aren't my ideas. And I am not a financial advisor. I'm not qualified to be giving you my own financial advice. What I've done is listened to and read some authors on these topics, and I'm going to pass on their information to you. And then third, some money hints and myths. Some information I've gathered along the way during my time here at UHS that hopefully will be helpful to you. And you see that in the corner? That's a target. So my hope is that this can give you something of a strategy or a target to shoot for if ultimately we're on the same page. We agree that these four things are a logical foundation to proceed from, and we all agree about. So, short-term plan. Strategy for building wealth and freedom. I'm not advocating that you pick up any one of these books. I'm just letting you know that I'm familiar with them. And the interesting thing is that when you read these types of authors, even though they put their own particular spin, their own verbiage to building strategies for building wealth, ultimately there are some high points that are all the same. And so I'm going to try to deliver those to you. A few basic steps. And my assumption is going to be that there's a few of us here in this classroom that ultimately are facing a large amount of personal debt. So what I'd like to do is transmit the wisdom that they would give to you, the advice or the strategy, to go from a point of having substantial personal debt to a place where we have savings and can think further into the future towards a long-term plan about saving for bigger items or saving for retirement. So step number one, even if you're facing tens of thousands or even larger amounts of personal debt, these authors generally suggest that the best thing that you can do is build a $1,000 emergency fund. Often we see surveys like this one over here asking Americans, how would you deal with a major unexpected expense? This one came out from Bankrate. And in this case, if you had a $1,000 unexpected expense, how would you deal with it? I want to point out a few things here. You know, a substantial portion of people have the savings. They could handle it. But there are three items here that essentially suggest that people would need to go into debt to handle an unexpected expense. So here we have finance with a credit card. Here we have let's go to borrow from family or friends or take out a personal loan. So when you add these three together, approximately a third of people would need to go into debt to be able to handle an unexpected expense of this nature. So that's not ideal. The objective here is to avoid further debt. So the first step that these advisors would suggest is to build an emergency fund. How do we do that? Well, I know most people don't get thrilled about the idea of doing a budget, but essentially the first step is to look at how you're spending money, whether it's for the last year or for the last month, and get a sense of what you need to spend money on, and also get a sense of what you don't need to be spending money on. So if you're trying to trim things down or tighten up the proverbial belt, maybe we don't need the mansion in the Hamptons, maybe we don't need the most recent phone, maybe we don't need an extravagant vehicle. And by buying things that are humbler or living with things that are older, it's possible that we're able to free up some money so that we can build this $1,000 emergency fund. So those are some bigger items. Those obviously you would need to sell or make some major adjustments with. But some of these authors suggest it's very, very possible to trim down your spending by being disciplined with weekly and monthly items. So one suggestion of some of these authors is that you literally take out cash from an ATM for your weekly budgeted items and you put it in an envelope. So I'm going to allow myself $150 for groceries, or I'm going to allow myself $40 for eating out. And once you've spent the cash in that envelope for that week, you spend no more. And that's a way to stick to a budget and also free up some money so that you can do this first step, build a $1,000 emergency fund. Hopefully you're able to free up some money to be able to do that, and then these authors suggest now it's time to pay off that consumer debt. Here's just some info I've gathered from talking to people and from the internet. Credit cards have a massive amount of interest associated with them typically, large amounts. Car loans can have a large amount of interest associated with it. College debt, much lower, but still a substantial amount of interest. And interest is simply you paying money to borrow money from other people. It's stuff that if possible, that would be money in your bank account if you can avoid paying that interest. So the strategies that these financial authors typically suggest is something called the snowball method. Now there are a couple ways to use this method. I'm going to just explain one. So here's a hypothetical situation. Let's say that you have a credit card that has $1,000 on it on the left over here. And you also have a car loan for $5,000. You have another credit card with $8,000 on it, and you have a college loan for $20,000. So what the snowball method suggests is that you start with the lowest debt. And the rationale for that, because some people like to tackle the highest interest rate first, but the rationale for tackling the lowest debt first is because you'll pay it off the quickest. And most humans need that sort of quick gratification, an indication that you're moving in the right direction. And so the rationale for employing the snowball method this way is so that you get a quick win early on. So let me throw some numbers up on the screen that might represent the minimum payments. So you're putting these red numbers into each of these debts. And in some of the cases, you're not even attacking the amount that you owe. It's simply interest payments that you're keeping things at bay. So to pay off consumer debt, you really need to be able to accomplish step number one. And let me say that if you're not able to get through step number one, like truly not able, then ultimately there are deeper issues in play. Either you've acquired too much debt and you probably should speak with someone, or you don't have enough income. And the way to solve that would be to work more, perhaps just short term. So hopefully you've been able to build a budget, stick to it, accomplish step one, and let's say hypothetically in the process you realize that you can devote an extra $180. You've been able to trim down your expenses, and every month you have an extra $180. So instead of paying the minimum $20 here, you're able to contribute $200 a month to this smaller loan. And you realize really quickly here that in just 5 months, you're going to be able to pay off that $1,000. That's a quick win. The reason this is called the snowball method is because what you then do after paying off your first smallest debt is snowball the $200 into the minimum payment on your next smallest loan. So instead of paying $250 on your car lease, you pay $450, the 200 plus the 250. And you can see that relatively quickly, within about a year, you're going to be able to get rid of your car loan. You then take that $450 and snowball it with the $80 minimum payment on this larger credit card debt. So instead of paying the minimum payment, you're able now to pay $530. A little bit more time passes, but eventually you're able to pay that off. And then you do the exact same thing. You take that money that you had been paying towards that debt, snowball it with the minimum payment of your college loan. And when all is said and done, in this hypothetical example, in about 4 to 5 years, you are now debt-free. And not only are you debt-free, you've freed up $880 a month to put towards other uses. So at this point, you've achieved a great deal of freedom. At that point, these authors suggest the next step. Before you really start thinking about investing long-term, there's still a layer of security that's needed here. They suggest that you save 3 to 6 months of expenses. And the rationale behind that is that it's almost inevitable in an earning lifetime that a worker will face some sort of situation where they can't earn income for a period of time, whether it's a layoff or a furlough or an injury or some sort of personal situation. Could be a job change where you need to rely on your savings. And so step one, a basic emergency fund. Step two, pay off all of your consumer debt. And step three, develop a 3 to 6 month fund for a more longer term situation where you can't earn income. Now, if you can get there, you're in great shape. And imagine that situation with me. If you're facing debt right now, imagine what it will be like to be here, to have debt paid off and to have tens of thousands of dollars in the bank. It's a place of great security and great freedom. And it's really at this point that these advisors pivot and say, okay, now it's time to be thinking long term. You've created a very secure place financially, so now it's time to strive to save a significant percentage of your annual income so that you can achieve your other objectives, whether your objective is to retire or to give your money away or to buy your Corvette. This is the point where you really can shift and save for your larger, longer-term goals. Now, let me address 3 ways in which people tend to save money and give you pluses and minuses. Number 1, you've heard of people stashing money in their mattresses. In fact, it's interesting. My father, I think it actually may have been my grandmother, inherited a feather tick from some of my ancestors who immigrated. And sewn into the feather tick were dollars, literal, silver certificates and gold certificates. So this has been done a lot historically in the past, but there may be reasons why people do it. And it's interesting that there has been some research that suggests that millennials are holding on to cash at much higher rates than other generational cohorts. The reason being that they saw the damage caused by the financial collapse in 2008 and 2009. So there certainly are reasons why you might want to do this. There is a certain degree of security. It keeps your money out of view of some people. But there's obviously a physical risk here. If it could be stolen or you could have a house fire. But there's another risk here, and that's the risk of the value of the money over time. I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the concept of inflation, I should say. That over time, the purchasing power of money goes down. This is why we play games with our grandparents and ask them, when you were my age or when you were a child, how much was a gallon of milk? Or how much was a gallon of gasoline? And it's like 10 cents or something absurdly low. And we realized that the purchasing power of money was something very different 60 or 80 years ago. Financial advisor Ray Dalio says that it may help you think about inflation as a form of tax. Now, over time, historically, inflation has averaged somewhere between 2 and 3%. So what Ray Dalio says is that if you're going to hold on to cash, consider it being taxed at the rate of 2 to 3%, which may not seem like a lot, but after a decade or 2 decades, that leads to a massive loss of purchasing power. So yes, you certainly may have the same number of physical dollars under your mattress, the same number of dollars, but the ability for those dollars to purchase things has gone down dramatically over time. So most financial advisors would say this is not a prudent strategy for the vast majority of your money. It shouldn't be here for the majority of your money. Let me show you 2 other options, and this is the direction that most advisors would point you. Number 1, an account that earns simple interest. I don't know that there are a lot of these out there, but basically a savings account that earns simple interest is one that only earns interest on the money you put in it. So let's say hypothetically you put $10,000 into a savings account and you're getting a 5% return. At the end of year 1, you have $10,050. And what happens at the end of year 2? You're only still earning interest on that original $10,000. So you're going to get another 50. Every year you get 50, and that's why that blue line is linear. Every year, you know that that investment is only going to gain interest on what we call the principal, the amount of money that you put in the account. Again, advisors generally would suggest that this is not the best strategy for the majority of your income, that there's this thing called compounding interest. And in an investment vehicle or an account that earns compounding interest, you earn interest not only on the amount of money you put in, the $10,000, you're also earning interest on the interest. So let's say the $50. So that the second year, you're earning interest on $10,050, and it grows and it grows. And if you look at the red line there, the results are not substantially different for the first 10 years, and not even that much different for the first 20 or even 30 years. But if you hold your money in an account or an investment vehicle that gains compounding interest over a long period of time, it becomes exponential. It shoots through the roof. So that if you start when you're young, over the course of your earning lifetime, by your 50s and your 60s, your money will have grown substantially. This is with the huge caveat, or the asterisk, that you've been able to maintain a decent rate of return over time. And so it's this direction that most financial advisors would encourage people to go. But bear in mind, this involves a degree of risk. There may be less risk with stashing your cash under a mattress. There may be less risk in an account that only gains simple interest. But the reward is substantially lower, and the concern would be that if you do either of those 2 things, that amount of money that you saved by the time you're 65 may not sustain you through a retirement that lasts 2 or 3 or more decades. I like to ask this question: do you think a nurse can save $1 million? And mathematically speaking, and very practically speaking, absolutely yes. And so here's some simple math for you. Let's say that a nurse works for 45 years. They work from 20 to 65. And every year, let's say they had every advantage in life, and they start off life without any debt. And so they're able from the get-go to put away $5,000 every year. And this may seem like a large amount of money to you right now, but this is certainly doable. If not now, it's doable at some point in your future. But let's, this is a hypothetical example. This nurse had every advantage. And so they put away $5,000 for their 45 years of earning lifetime, and they do it in an untaxed account. We'll talk about that in a bit. And they're successful, and they're able to earn an average of 6% rate of return over those 45 years. Well, this ultimately is just simple math. And when you do this math with compounding interest, this individual would end up a millionaire by age 65. So yes, a nurse can save $1 million. Let's say you're like me. Let's say that money didn't matter to you, or you didn't start saving early. Or let's say you have substantial debt and you have a few years ahead of you of working out from beneath that debt. Well, here's another pathway that is a very real possibility. Let's say later in life you start saving. Yes, you would need to save a larger amount every year, $10,000. But let's say that nurse saves $10,000 a year for 35 years. They do it in an untaxed account and are able to get that 6% rate of return. That nurse too would end up a millionaire. And I want to do some really, really simple math with you. Let's multiply 35 times 10,000. That is essentially the amount of money that the nurse is earning. So they're earning $350,000. But because they are willing to risk that money in an account that gains compounding interest and do it in an untaxed account, that due to the compounding interest, the beauty of compounding interest, it ultimately grows exponentially. So how does this occur? Again, it has to do with compounding interest. If this is something you want to explore, I don't have the ability to go into it now, but there are lots of resources out there that can help you understand how compounding interest works and the risks associated with that. And then I told you we talked about untaxed. If your earnings and your money are taxed every year, which they are if they're not tax sheltered, if you just put them in a bank account, they're taxed. That removes the amount, a small amount of money every year, and ultimately lowers the amount that you can gain over time. And so the government has set up a number of tax shelters or places where you don't have to pay tax every year. You pay it at the end when you pull out the money, or there are other tax shelters where you pay it in the beginning and then you don't ever pay it again. I put BPAS here because they are the administrator of our 403B here at UHS. They are just one possible pathway. There are many others. And again, I don't have the ability here to go deeply into the options that exist out there, nor do I want to be perceived as giving you advice or the direction that you should go. But there are options outside of UHS that are great options to allow your money, your savings to grow in a non-taxed fashion, or you can certainly use the UHS option. I want to talk a little bit more about this because this may be a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible, and there are people and benefits that you can talk to. And just show you a couple screenshots here. It's very simple to change the percentage that is put into your retirement account. So if we go way back here, these advisors are going to suggest that you should save a substantial portion of your income. Well, to do that, you'll need to adjust the percentage that's removed and put into your retirement accounts, whether you choose to go with UHS's accounts or some external account. So moving forward again, I just wanted to show you the screenshots. It's very simple. You would log on to BPAS. I've worked with them. They've walked me through the process. But once you've logged on, I believe it's under this transaction tab that you have the option to change how much money you are deferring into your 403B. And so whether you want to set aside a percentage or an actual dollar amount every pay period, you then drop down this number and hit save. And if memory serves me correctly, in one pay period, that will change. It's that simple. So I don't want this to be a barrier to prevent you from saving more money. It's very, very simple. I also do work with one of those external companies. They are more than willing to help you. Obviously, they want to have your money with their services. And so they are more than willing to help you set up accounts with them as well. But consider things like IRAs, Roth IRAs, we have the 403B. Each of these are different designations that allow you to save money without it being taxed every year. So I'm going to wrap this up with just a few hints and try to dispel a couple myths that I've heard along the way. So many of these financial advisors would suggest that overtime and critical shifts are a very strategic way to build wealth. Now, obviously, in light of the earlier conversation, we don't want to push it too hard. That if we push it too hard, our performance suffers, our health suffers, our patient care suffers. But if you have the ability to pick up small amounts of overtime and even critical shift, it's a great way to build wealth because you're getting paid at a higher rate. Now, I've often heard it said from colleagues, oh, I don't want to get too much overtime because it pushes me into a higher tax bracket. And I think there's a myth floating out there that when you are bumped into another tax bracket, all of your money is taxed at that higher rate. And so I just wanted to address that really quickly. Here is the tax bracket and rates for a single person filing taxes in 2019. And I think it's helpful to think of tax brackets as buckets rather than just a percentage. And essentially the way that taxation works in your income is that the first portion of your income goes into the first bucket or the first bracket. So the first $9,700 you will earn if you are single will be taxed at 10%. Then the next dollar above that, 9,701, not that entire amount, just that $1, and then everything earned up to 39,475 is taxed at 12%. And then everything earned from that point above up to 84,200 is taxed at 22%, and so on. And so if you were bumped up to, say, the next tax bracket, let's say you worked hard and you earned $84,201 in a particular year, only $1 would be taxed at 24%. So yes, if you have bumped into a higher tax bracket, that additional money will be taxed at your highest rate, but it doesn't change the rate for the lower amounts. Your first $9,700 is still only taxed at 10%. So this may or may not make a big difference for you, but I wanted to dispel that myth that by working too much, suddenly all of your money is taxed more. No, that money may be taxed at a higher rate. In fact, it probably is taxed at a higher rate than your initial money, but all of your money is not suddenly taxed at a higher rate. The other thing that may be in play, some employers may hold on to more money than they need to at the source. So it's called source withholding. Every pay period, UHS has to kind of extrapolate and say, how much money is this employee going to earn over the entire year? And do their best to estimate how much they should hold on to. And if you have a paycheck that is really, really large, they may hold on to more money than they need to. But know that if that happens, it's very likely at the end of the year that your income will be lower than if every paycheck was as high as that one paycheck. And it may be possible that if UHS held on to too much money in the form of taxes in that one paycheck, that you will then ultimately see it back in your tax refund. So yes, sometimes you'll see more money taken out in a pay period where you've worked substantial overtime. That may or may not necessarily be accurate, and you may see some of that money back at the end of the year. Hint number 2, if you're single, you are paying a lot more money in taxes than married people with the same income. This may be very obvious, you may know this already, but I just wanted to throw this up there. Let's say, hypothetically, you earn $60,000 a year. From about $39,000 up to that $60,000, if you are single, you are paying 22%. So you're paying about 22% on around $20,000 of that year's income. But if you file married in 2019, you have the ability to earn all the way up to $78,000, more than that, and you're only going to be taxed 12%. May be obvious. The reason I bring this up, though, is that retirement accounts can help with taxes. So let me tell you a little bit about a strategy some people use, especially if you're single now, because right now, when you're single, you are paying the highest amount of taxes that you can. And so I want to ask you to ask yourselves, is there any possibility that you see yourself getting married in the future? Is it possible? Is it probable? And if you answer yes to that, if that is the case, then it may be prudent to try to set aside money now, and so that when you retire, you are taxed at a lower rate. Because again, if you can earn money now but not have it taxed now, and defer the taxation to when you're 65 and you are married, if the tax structure remains the same, there's a lot of what ifs here, but if the tax structure remains the same, then you'll pay less tax. So here's just an example. Let's say you're single, you earn $60,000 this year, and you push $10,000 into the UHS 403B pre-tax. It means that $10,000 will not be taxed today at your high rate of taxation as a single taxpayer. The government will only look at the $50,000 that remains and consider that your taxable income. And so if 40 years later or 45 years later, you then pull out that $10,000 and the income that you've earned, interest that you've earned on it, and you happen to be married at that time, and the tax structure is similar, then you will pay less taxes. I want to wrap up this conversation with a thought-provoking video. This individual's name is Jose Mujica. He was the president of Uruguay. He's known to have donated over 90% of his income to charitable causes. He has a very strong perspective, but he says something in here that I find very, very profound. So give this a listen.
O logras ser feliz con poco y liviano de equipaje, porque la felicidad está dentro tuyo, o no logras nada. Esto no es una apología de la pobreza, esto es una apología de la sobriedad. Pero como hemos inventado una sociedad de consumo, consumista, y la economía tiene que crecer, porque si no crece es una tragedia. Inventamos una montaña de consumo superfluo y hay que tirar y vivir comprando y tirando. Y lo que estamos gastando es tiempo de vida. Porque cuando yo compro algo, o tú, no lo compras con plata. Lo compras con el tiempo de vida que tuviste que gastar para tener esa plata. Pero con esta diferencia. La única cosa que no se puede comprar es la vida. La vida se gasta. Y es miserable gastar la vida para perder libertad.
So the thing I find very profound in that video is the notion that we are trading our life hours for money, that essentially we're swapping it for green paper. And whenever I approach a purchase, I like to think to myself, how much of my life did I have to spend to acquire this? And ultimately, is it worth it? So I hope that provokes some thought. If you have any questions or if you have any feedback about this conversation, I would love to hear from you. So please reach out to me via email or on the phone. I hope you're doing well, and thank you for listening to this topic.